Oh.
Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in
Williamsburg, Virginia.
Hot damn, you do get around, don't you?
Just outside of Yorktown, where Lord Cornwallis surrendered his army to George Washington. Some guy named Lafayette was there.
Stop.
Just happens to be our topic today.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. Chris and I may travel the globe. I mean, I didn't travel much of the globe to get to Williamsburg, but part of it. But we're still here on Sundays to have a cocktail and talk to you about history.
And I wanted to also welcome all of our top shelf supporters that we
Yes.
appreciate immensely, of course. And hey, did we get some more? Because the graphic.
We did. Connie McKenzie added, right? It's something good eye,
Connie.
Chris.
See, we've leveled out.
We are going to have to go to a smaller font if we get more, and from let's wish that is a problem we have to deal with.
That's a good problem to have.
So listen, everybody, who's there? Who's out there, and where are they?
Neil Shara is here, and Neil Hilliard from Colorado. Lizzie Borden, of course. It's always good to see a regular. And I checked to make sure Marcus is with us, so we can officially.
And we
start.
have a Gerv. Do you think you say that?
I think so.
From Barcelona, Spain. I don't know where Xavier is, our other Barcelona viewer, but hopefully he can come on. And everybody who's coming on, thank you very much. Listen, Chris, before we get started, I do have a visual history quiz for you. Okay, and I want to say to everybody, I have not told Chris anything about this, but yesterday I came across this marker. And Chris, I was not in Massachusetts.
Bollocks.
I was in North Carolina.
Bollocks.
What does this refer to, or where is it?
That's the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge, isn't it?
No, I know you want me to go there. It was way off my route. I couldn't go there.
Oh, see, then maybe that was the first battle in this monument's just wrong.
This is actually at Almanance, North Carolina. And is that your second guess?
No, of course, yeah. I was talking with Anna about that just this morning.
But it's the regulators, Governor Tryon against the regulators in 1771. And I think that's a little after thinking that it's the first battle of the American Revolution. Yeah, not quite. But we as long as we don't tell the people from Lexington and Concord, we should be in good shape there.
So Chris, did you just start jumping on your hat or screaming or trying to knock over the monument? Or what?
Yeah, I did. Listen, I think we stalled enough to get going.
I think so, yeah.
All right.
So
but Chris, we haven't opened. There's a whole routine. We've done 81 shows.
I'm so excited.
81 shows, and you haven't gotten it down yet.
Hey, the bar is open. Did you bring that with you? You didn't forget it this time?
That is a bell on my iPhone.
Oh, I knew there was a reason.
Yeah, all right. Go for it, man.
All right. Anyway, so what I would try to say before you interrupted
it's going to keep ringing the entire show now. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. No. This week we're talking about the Marquis de Lafayette, one of the famous characters of the Revolution that we don't really know enough about. And we're here to discuss the Marquis with Mike Duncan. Many of you probably are already aware of Mike. He is the very popular podcaster and New York Times bestselling author of The Storm Before the Storm, the beginning of the end of the Roman Republic. And his history of Rome is considered a landmark in podcasting. He is currently producing a series of podcasts called Revolutions that talk about the great political revolutions in history and how they've impacted modern history. So we're here this week, though, to talk about his new book, Hero of Two Worlds, The Marquis de Lafayette and the Age of Revolution. Hey. Hello,
Mike. Welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Mike, I wanted to start out with. Are you?
Don't get all effusive on us now, Mike.
I haven't even.
It's very nice to be here. Ring the bell some more times.
Yeah, that's all right. I want to start with a quote now from the book, but Lafayette is one of these characters. He's looms large in the history of the Revolution. He's the darling of the Revolution. Americans to have a definitely positive view of the Marquis, but in reading your book, as you do with a lot of people that you read biographies about, there's a lot more to this person. And I wanted to quote the French writer Chateaubriand, whose postmortem on Lafayette was, Monsieur de Lafayette had only one idea, and unfortunately for him, it was the one of the century. The fixity of this idea has made its empire. It served as a blindfold. It prevented him from looking to the right and to the left. He walked steadily in one line. He advanced without falling between the precipices, not because he saw them, but because he did not see them. Blindness took the place of genius. Whatever is fixed is fatal, and whatever is fatal is powerful. So just to kind of get the conversation rolling, what is the idea that Chateaubriand is talking about, and where does Lafayette fit into that?
Yeah, so the idea that Chateaubriand is talking about there is basically like liberty and equality. But really, like, Lafayette associates himself most especially with the concept of liberty and the idea of liberty as sort of an abstract force that is his guiding North Star as he goes through his life. And Lafayette, it's very true. You know, Chateaubriand says this. He's not a genius, and Lafayette wasn't a genius, but he was a very bright guy. And that quote that you just used is like amidst some other, like, there's flattering quotes and there's negative quotes about Lafayette. And you know, some people will say he was a dunce or a dullard, or he didn't see the dangers that were in front of him. But he did. He was a bright guy. But really, is an individual allowed to live sort of a free life where they are able to sort of manifest as they want to? Are they able to do the things that they want to do, the things that they want to think, you know, go do the acts that they want to do without being hindered by, you know, an oppressive government? And this is something that Lafayette picks up when he's a teenager and kind of guides him through his entire life until he dies at the ripe old age of 74. He dies happy in his bed. So, you know, for as much as Chateaubriand is saying like, oh, you know, he's going through this line and didn't quite know what was where it was taking him. It took him to a comfortable retirement and death in bed, which is, I think, something we're all ultimately aiming for.
Which is a pretty good result for a revolution.
Yeah.
Involved in two revolutions and multiple battles.
Most of his contemporaries did not die warm and happy in their bed, surrounded by loved ones.
Right.
If I read correctly, you literally learned French and then moved to France for 3 years, dragging your school-age children and your wife with you to research this book.
I didn't drag my wife. I didn't drag my wife to Paris. No, we dragged our kids. We dragged our kids to Paris. My wife was very encouraging of it when I said, "Hey, I got this notion to write a biography of Lafayette, but we might have to go to Paris for a while to research the book." She was like,
so she was good with that, just to confirm.
Yes, she said you should pitch the publisher on this idea.
We said we wouldn't dive into your personal life, but there you go.
Here we are, like right away. We're in the
like 2 minutes in. Anyway, that's a commitment. So why is Lafayette worth it?
Lafayette is worth it because, as you know, the Revolutions podcast that I make each season is a different political revolution and social revolution, and I'm moving chronologically through them. So the second season was the American Revolution, the third season was the French Revolution, fourth season is the Haitian Revolution, fifth season Spanish American Independence, sixth season is the French Revolution of 1830. And those seasons encompass sort of what we would call the age of democratic revolution, which roughly begins with the American Revolution in 1775 and then kind of runs through the 1820s as Bolivar and Jose de San Martin are liberating Spanish America. And you also have sort of the transition into Greek Wars of Independence and liberal Spanish revolts and liberal Italian revolts in the 1820s. And Lafayette is just involved in all of this stuff. He shows up as a teenager on the doorstep of the Second Continental Congress and says, you know, hey, I've recently been commissioned a major general by Silas Deane, who you guys haven't actually talked to in like 12 months on account of the Royal Navy. But I'm here to join your army. And then he is a major player in the American Revolution. He's not as important as Benjamin Franklin or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but he is intimately involved in the Continental Army, and he's right there at Washington's side through the rest of the war after he shows up in 1777. He's a pretty major figure in the French Revolution all through 1789, 1790, 1791, on into 1792 and then he gets evicted from the French Revolution because he runs afoul of Robespierre and the Jacobins. And then as we go forward, he's in correspondence with Simon Bolivar, because Bolivar is looking to Lafayette as somebody who sort of personifies everything that Bolivar is trying to do down in South America. And then as an old man, as a 70-year-old, Lafayette is very heavily involved in the French Revolution of 1830, overthrowing his former teenage classmate, the guy who was the Comte d'Artois, who becomes King Charles X. So by the time that all of this is winding up and Lafayette has just been everywhere, he, more than anybody else, I think, personifies this age of democratic revolution in its totality, in the fact that it occurred on both sides of the Atlantic. It's going on in the Caribbean, it's going on in South America, and North America, and Europe. And I was saying to myself, like, I would love to write this book. I don't speak French, though. I don't read French. I don't know how to do that. That's not what I actually studied Japanese in high school. And so I decided one day
about Lafayette. And
no,
Japanese,
there was no Japanese.
And
There was no
archives.
Japanese to speak of, and that was also like almost 30 years ago. But yeah, I decided if I'm going to do this, I need to learn French, and so I just started learning French. I started taking classes. I used apps. I just started reading kind of voraciously in French, and then that carried us over to France. And yeah, we lived there for 3 years. We lived there from 2018 to 2021, so that I could write the book.
So, Mike, I mean, I think most Americans have a vague notion of Lafayette's background, but I want to get into that a little bit. He's not the most likely revolutionary, so I'd like you to kind of let people know where he comes from in terms of his family, and also sort of the intellectual roots of this, what at the time would be considered radicalism.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really true, because if you look at him just on a piece of paper, in 1777, like when he gets on the boat and goes across the Atlantic to join the Continental Army, he is, arguably one of the richest single individuals in the Kingdom of France. He was an orphan. He was the only surviving male heir of multiple branches of his family. So he had like sort of multiple fortunes all land on his head by the time that he's about 12, 13 years old. So he's incredibly wealthy. And because he was the sole surviving male heir with an incredible fortune, he becomes, the middle bit of his life is a bit of a Jane Austen book, where he then becomes like the most eligible bachelor in France. And he marries into the Noailles family. And the Noailles family are probably, second only to the Bourbon monarchy, the Bourbon royal family themselves in terms of their wealth and power and prestige. He marries this woman, Adrienne, who is a daughter of this family. So he is now in literally the inner circle of the French nobility. He is in the social scene of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI before they become king and queen, when they're just sort of teenagers out at Versailles. That's his social scene. The richest and most powerful people, probably, you could say in Europe, and then really if you look across the whole world, you're talking about, the imperial families in China, and then the royal family in France, who's richer and more powerful. And so he does then come out of this world deciding that what he really wants to do is run away from home and go help a bunch of Anglo-Protestant farmers break away from the British government. Why does he do this? He does this partly because he actually doesn't feel like he fits in with this world. He's not actually comfortable in the rarefied air of this elite class of super rich and super powerful people. He doesn't really fit in with them. And then he was born in 1757, and he's a teenager in the mid 1770s. And this is like the heyday of the French Enlightenment. So there are all of these new ideas that have new currency inside the educated elites. we're talking about, the encyclopedists, we're talking about Rousseau, we're talking about Voltaire, who are introducing new ideas like liberty, like equality, like popular sovereignty and government. He's reading Montesquieu about the separation of powers and how to actually have a rational government as opposed to just some irrational absolutist monarchy that is built on the superstitions perpetuated by the Catholic Church. So he's imbibing all of this stuff as a teenager, as he is also feeling uncomfortable basically in his home life, and he sees these people who are breaking away from the British Empire, not just doing it in a self-interested way, but doing it on behalf of these ideals that he at least believes that they are exemplifying these sort of abstractions that he's been learning about. And so when he goes over there, he believes that he's going to go have a great adventure on behalf of these notions of liberty and equality. And he quite likes the sound of this. He thinks that this is going to make him a famous person. He thinks that he's going to be able to make his mark on the world, that he's going to come home sort of crowned with glory and become a great hero, which he wants to do, and ultimately succeeds spectacularly beyond anybody's, I think probably even beyond his own wildest expectations. When he goes over there, it's not a sure thing that he's not just going to embarrass himself.
Yeah,
but instead he proves himself and makes his mark on the world.
I wanted to ask about that. He arrives in the U.S. in 1777. Let's emphasize he's 19 years old.
Yeah, he's 19.
Right. He has snuck out of France essentially against the orders of the king. So now he's persona non grata in France. He comes to the U.S. where basically they are sick and tired of French officers trying to come in and gain glory with the U.S. So this does not seem like a particularly advantageous start. Within 2 years, this guy is a rock star in both the colonies and, when he returns to France, in France. So what the hell happens? What does he do that makes him such a rock star?
So when he books it, the talk, he becomes the talk of Paris and Versailles because he's running away in defiance basically of the king, and they're all
he's breaking the law, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very debatable whether or not a lettre de cachet was actually issued, for his arrest. Right. But he was essentially fleeing the moral equivalent of an arrest warrant to prevent him from leaving France, and certainly in defiance of the king's orders to have no more French officers go to help these rebels, because the French at that point did not want to get involved with a war with Britain. So when he runs away, the talk is a lot of like, man, this guy's kind of crazy. He's done this crazy thing. He's probably going to mess it all up, and that'll be really good fodder, for gossip in the salons. And when he arrives in the New World, and when he shows up in Philadelphia, man, they don't want to have anything to do with him, because as you said, French officers had been showing up, demand like, give me 1 million livres a week and I'll show you how to run a war. And these guys were like privates in the army back in Europe, and they're saying, oh, I was a major, or I was a general. And sometimes this is played for laughs. When Baron von Steuben comes over and he's like, oh, I served with Frederick the Great. It was like he was like a page for Frederick the Great. He wasn't like a general on Frederick the Great's staff. So when Lafayette shows up, they kind of don't want to have anything to do with him. But then they get letters like from Benjamin Franklin saying this kid is actually different. He's actually a marquis. He actually is rich. He actually knows the king and queen. And what Franklin knew and Washington knew and everybody in the Second Continental Congress knew was, if we can secure French support for our rebellion, that's probably how we're going to win this war. We need their money. We need their men. We need their guns. And more than anything else, we need anything resembling a navy. Because we can't fight the Royal Navy on their own terms. And Lafayette represents a direct conduit and direct communications back to the inner circle of French decision-making. So they say, all right, man, we'll take you on. We'll make you a major general. You can go be with George Washington. He'll take you on. And Washington's like, oh, God, why are you putting this French teenager in my camp? Like, I don't want this guy. I don't want any of these people in my camp. And you're actually saying I have to like babysit this French teenager. So the question though is, how does he break through of all of this? And I think it does happen at Brandywine. There's a couple of things that he says and does leading up to Brandywine. He's like, I've come here to learn from you, not to teach you how to do anything. Like, that kind of endears him to Washington. But at Brandywine, which is just a couple of weeks after he's joined the army, he if we know the Battle of Brandywine, basically the right flank of the Continental Army starts to crumple under heavy British attack. Lafayette does not shrink from this fight. He runs towards this crumpling line. He spends a lot of time under withering British fire trying to encourage the Continentals to hold firm, to shore up the line. He himself gets wounded. He's shot through the leg. He keeps fighting. Then when Washington shows up in this part of the battle and says, all right, we pretty much have to retreat. And I need you in particular. First of all, I need you not to die because you're incredibly important to our political relations with the French. So I can't have you dying on me. Please get out of here. And Lafayette says, okay, I'll take off. He's bleeding from the leg. He's lightheaded. And he notices that there's a key bridge across like a little river or creek that the retreating Continental Army is going to have to cross this bridge in order to get safely away from the British. And he holds this bridge. And as other Continental soldiers arrive, he's organizing a defense and an organized defense of this bridge so that everybody else can get away. And this is the second place that George Washington finds him. Lafayette's only been in this army for a couple of weeks. He doesn't know any of these people. This is not like Band of Brothers stuff where he needs to save these people who he's been serving with for years. He barely knows any of these people, but he's very clearly willing to put his life on the line, very clearly is keeping his head under fire. He's doing this all with a wounded leg. And I think at this point, Washington is looking at him and saying, okay, I think maybe you are actually different from most of the other French officers who have washed up on our shores. And from that point forward, everything that Lafayette does simply endears him more to the Second Continental Congress and to Washington personally. And his exploits start getting back across to the other side of the Atlantic. Like he's actually done it. He's fighting in battles, getting wounded, coming out the other side of it, glowing, as opposed to with a black cloud over his head. So that his reputation sort of, I think, all emerges out of the Battle of Brandywine.
So, but something I'm curious about, and obviously as much time as you spent with Lafayette, you would be the person to ask. When he leaves for America, how much of it is just, I'm a young guy and I want to be a stud and it's the adventure, and how much is it kind of naivete, and how much is he really committed to this cause? Is this just a rich guy going out to, indulge himself, or is he, does the commitment come later, or is it?
No, I earnestly believe that it is simultaneous, right? Because I would never say that Lafayette wasn't doing this so he could go have a great adventure and be a famous, glorious warrior, which is what he had been aiming for from the time that he was like a toddler, because he was raised with the ethic and the ambitions of a French soldier, right? And he's supposed to go off and do these things. So that's obviously what he wants to do. But I also think that constitutionally, sort of in his heart from a very young age, he is idealistic. And we see him throughout his entire life wanting to, he sees things and wants to make them better. He has imbibed the rhetoric of progress and the rhetoric of advancement, right? If you see an injustice, correct the injustice. If you see somebody suffering, relieve the suffering. I think that he has that instinct inside of him that is complementing and acting alongside his own sort of personal need to achieve greatness as an ambitious individual in the world. So when he's sailing across the Atlantic, when he's on the boat, yes, he's hoping he can go have a great adventure, fight a battle, get a wound, so that he can come home and show it off to the girls, right? Which he does talk about that later. He's like, it's great. Everybody's fawning over me when he comes home. But I do think that he was moved by these abstract concepts of liberty and equality. And that's what he thought the Americans were up to. When he gets to America, after Brandywine, once he starts to settle in a little bit, he very quickly starts having sort of the scales fall from his eyes about what's actually happening in the United States. Like he comes over thinking every American is united in a Republican fever dream, hoping to break away from the British. And he finds out that that's really not the case, that it's actually like kind of a small, vocal, radical minority who are engaged in all this, who he supports, right? But he also begins to, it starts to churn in his brain a little bit as he's looking at African slaves who are living inside of this world of free, liberty-loving Republicans. He's like, well, this doesn't make a lot of sense in my head. So he develops a more nuanced understanding of what's going on in the United States. But I do think both personal ambition and sort of a selfless kind of idealism is driving him at all points of his life.
So can I just kind of add to that?
Go,
real
man.
quick?
Go.
Did you ever come across anything? Because I'm just very curious about this. How someone as committed to liberty as he was, from the background that he came from, how he squared being a citizen of, at that point, a totalitarian, an absolute monarch, right? How he justifies, hey, I'm of this world, but now I'm saying,
well, and what's going to happen is when he comes back, he goes off, he runs away from home at 19. He's back in France after the war. He's still in his early 20s. I mean, he plans on committing his life, his fortune, and his life, his fortune, sacred honor, and like all of that stuff, to the vast reform of everything that's happening in the Kingdom of France. Right? He wants a constitutional monarchy. He wants the French to have a Bill of Rights. He wants more rational administration. He wants everybody to be equal before the law. He wants freedom of religion. He doesn't want the Protestants to be mistreated anymore. If there's famine, he wants there to be grain relief for the poor. He sees the absolutist regime in France as something that has absolutely run its course historically and is running counter to the most advanced and progressive philosophical ideas that were coming out of that same monarchy. It's one of the great sort of contradictions in history that you have this absolutist regime in France that is also sort of the birthplace of some of the most progressive and modern thinking available. And there's quotes from the beginning of the book that I liked a lot because it ties back to all my work in Roman history, that all the people who went off and staged the French Revolution when they were in their 20s and 30s, right? When they were kids and they were being taught in these French schools, in this absolutist regime, they're all reading like Plutarch, right? Yeah. They're all being assigned Plutarch, or they're being assigned Polybius, or they're being assigned these sort of other, ancient writers who are extolling the virtues of Roman republicanism and Athenian democracy. And then they're learning all of this stuff, and then they're walking out into their own sort of the current events of their day. And they're like, well, none of this conforms with the virtues and the ethics that you are teaching me in school. And a lot of those guys, like Desmoulins talks about this, like I learned what I wanted in the French Revolution from the very schools of this absolutist regime that I was going to go try and overthrow.
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, listen, talk about the French Revolution a little bit. Lafayette wants to do all these things. He wants to transplant American ideals to France and liberty, equality, fraternity, etc. And it doesn't, I don't think we're giving away anything in the book to say it doesn't all go perhaps as swimmingly as Lafayette would like. And I know it's a super complicated subject, but maybe you can give us a little overview of kind of what his role is as he's kind of trying to thread the needle. I'm a revolutionary, sort of, but I'm also wanting to kind of protect the king and queen and keep the peace, sort of, as well.
Yeah, I mean, Lafayette has a very specific thing that he is aiming for in the French Revolution. And what he thinks that French culture and French society cannot advance all the way to a full-blown republic, the way that his friends in America were able to advance to a full-blown republic. And he had reasons for believing this, and I don't think that they were bad reasons for believing this, just in the sense that he didn't see his sort of French, his fellow Frenchmen and French people didn't really have a lot of experience with self-government the way that most of the colonial Americans did, at least the elites in the colonies. They were either in the House of Burgesses, or like if you're up in Massachusetts, you're taking place, you have town halls and elections and all of these things. So Lafayette thinks that there needs to be a transition stage where it's a constitutional monarchy, where the king is assigned certain rights, certain duties, things that the king can do and things that the king can't do. But there needs to also be some kind of participatory legislature or national assembly that helps in the crafting of laws. He does think that people should be allowed to participate in crafting the laws that they're going to live under. He thinks that there needs to be a very strong Bill of Rights. Right? He's very passionate about this notion of having a Bill of Rights, and he's one of the principal authors. He's one of the original authors of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which he make sure that he's the first person to introduce this, because getting back to that, he's being driven by two things: his own personal quest for ambitious glory, and then also this idealistic thing that he wants everybody to be able to live under. But once those things are in place, he thinks that everybody now needs to sort of get with the program. Like we did a revolution in 1789 because we didn't have these things, and the king wasn't going to let us have these things without a revolution. Then we had a revolution in 1789. And now that we have a constitution and a Bill of Rights and a participatory legislature, it's time for everybody to get on board with that program. And any future reforms that you want to do, any more that you want to do, you need to do it through elections and through parliament and through, the passage of laws, not further revolution, right? Because we've established that we have popular government now. And so let's just get on board with that. But unfortunately, he was like one of, 5, 6, 7 people in the Kingdom of France at the time who actually wanted a constitutional monarchy with a Bill of Rights. Half the people wanted to go back to the absolutist regime. You have all the royalists, like, who they think everything about the revolution is bad. And then on the other side, you have the Republicans who are like, well, if we're doing liberty and equality, like, why do we still have a king? Why do we still have an aristocracy? Why do we need any of this crap? Let's just go all the way to a republic. You're not thinking big enough. You're not thinking radical enough. And we want to bring true liberty and true equality to the citizens of France. And Lafayette was very definitely caught in the middle of that, and then had to run for it.
Yeah, but he obviously, as you say, he has strong opinions and a strong vision of what he wants to see happening in France. And he's also eyewitness to all of that quickly coming apart at the seams. And one of the things that I kind of like to get your thoughts on is, how is he explaining the revolution back to his old comrades in America? Because, as you say, he's a hero of two worlds and he keeps his feet in both worlds. How is he explaining, what's happening in France to Jefferson and Washington? And,
I would say right until the very end, he maintains a very hopeful optimism that all of this is actually going to work out for the best. Because in 1791, if you're living in 1791, things are hairy and things are tumultuous, but you don't know 1792 is coming. You don't know the Reign of Terror is coming. He doesn't know what's coming next. So he has ongoing correspondence with Washington. Now, Washington is writing back and saying, like, my dear Marquis, I am not thrilled by what I am hearing from France. Can you please allay my fears? I fret for you daily, and like all of these kinds of things. And then Lafayette would write back and say, like, oh, thank you, my dear general. But like, really, I think we'll be fine. Now, Jefferson was, of course, more enthusiastic about all of this than sort of Washington was, or Hamilton, because this is the thing, like, Lafayette's really close friends with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, right? So Jefferson is kind of enthusiastic about all of this. Hamilton is writing and been like, I don't think this is going to end well, man. And, Hamilton was ultimately right about that. But up until the very end, Lafayette believed that he was going to be able to thread the needle right up until the insurrection of August 10th in 1792. Lafayette thought that they were going to pull this off and have a constitutional monarchy. And then even when you go all the way, like, further on down his life, when he's a member of the Chamber of Deputies in the 1820s, this is after all the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, the Napoleonic Wars. You've got the Restoration Bourbons. Like, all this is now water under the bridge. And there were a lot of people who were saying the French Revolution was a bad idea. The French Revolution was a terrible thing. Look at all the damage that it wrought. And Lafayette, who was a victim of that radicalization, his wife, man, her whole family got killed practically in front of her eyes. Lafayette would say, no, the French Revolution itself was good and accomplished so many good things. And I can list for you, there's a great speech where he lists like 20 different things that wouldn't have happened absent the French Revolution, which he still defended. He just believed that there was a different path that they could have chosen to avoid the radicalization that happened, and that the Reign of Terror was bad and that radicalization was bad, but that didn't mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You don't just not do revolutions. You don't actually not go for these things. You go for them, even still.
Right.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking with Mike Duncan, and Mike is the author of the book Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. which is a terrifically readable and incredibly well-researched book by somebody who lived in France for 3 years. And that would be Mike, just by the way, to clarify.
Not yet.
I was not the researcher.
Are you a little sore about this, Rick? You keep lived in France for 3 years.
I did live in France for 3 years. Did the whole year? Did the whole year of COVID in a 500 square foot apartment?
I am
lucky
jealous.
me.
I am jealous. I don't care what you're saying.
All right.
I am still jealous.
Bonding.
Yeah.
Listen, I was just wondering, I was curious about this. Does Lafayette have a more mixed legacy in France than the U.S.? I mean, clearly in the United States, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. We have a question or two about it. We got a million towns named Lafayette. He was toasted as a hero. He's a big part of the revolution. How is he viewed in France today? Do people remember him, and how do they remember him?
I would say that he doesn't have much of a reputation in France, but not in the sense that he has a negative reputation. He's just not really that big of a figure in their history. As you said, like in terms of Lafayette's relationship with America and Americans and American historical memory, like we love the guy. He was this, dashing young Marquis who came over and helped us kick the crap out of the British. We all like these sorts of things.
Most of us, yeah.
Most of us like these sorts of things. Hello. But tweak. But back in France, he really, because he represented this thing that kind of neither side wanted in the French Revolution, he becomes somewhat politically homeless going forward. And what that means is that in France, I mean, we in the United States, we argue about the meaning of the American Revolution to this day, right? Like, what did the founders really mean by this? What was the Constitution actually trying to do? Like, we still argue about the American Revolution. And in France, ever since the French Revolution, an ongoing political debate with them has been, what did the French Revolution mean? They have always been arguing with each other about what the French Revolution meant. And when you get into the 20th century, you have sort of conservatives, traditional Catholics, crypto royalists who think that everything that happened from 1789 on was just a horrible thing that never should have happened. It was one of the greatest crimes in human history, the French Revolution. On the other side, you have Republicans and I would say like left-wing socialists and Marxists who laud the Jacobins, the radical Republicans, the people who were pushing for real freedom, real liberty, real equality, tearing down all of these old feudal structures that needed to be destroyed. But those guys on the left viewed Lafayette as somebody who was trying to help keep the monarchical regime in place, right? He was defending Louis and Marie Antoinette, whereas the conservatives all look at Lafayette and see somebody who helped get the French Revolution going in the first place, who was the jailer of the king and queen, not their defender. And so basically nobody in current French politics and current French, academia is looking at Lafayette as somebody worth defending. He's not really a hero or a villain. He's just sort of put off to one side as an irrelevant person who didn't accomplish anything. He didn't write any great historical treatise. He didn't write any great philosophical works. He's just off to one side. And like, there was a couple of people who I would talk to there. There's a very famous department store there called Galeries Lafayette. And so when I said I'm writing a book about Lafayette, they asked me, is it a book about the guy who started Galeries Lafayette? And I was like, no, man, Galeries Lafayette is called Galeries Lafayette because it was on a street that was named after the guy that I'm writing my biography about, General Lafayette. And they would go, oh, who's that? But it is, I do think it's worth noting that when Lafayette died, like, he was a very active politician right up to the end of his life. He never retired. Like, he was still in the Chamber of Deputies when he died. And there was a great deal of concern inside the July monarchy that his death would be the trigger for some kind of Republican uprising. And when Chateaubriand, who we talked about at the beginning, offers a very eloquent and kind of poetic description of Lafayette's funeral, where they're talking about hundreds of thousands of people turn out in the streets to watch the funeral procession. So even though his standing in history in contemporary France isn't really that great, when he died, he didn't die in obscurity. He did not die as an unknown person. He died as a very popular person who the streets of Paris turned out to mourn and celebrate, like when he finally kicked the bucket.
So kind of along the lines of that question you just answered, getting back to America, he seems to be the one founding father or a revolutionary hero or however you want to classify that group of men who has not gotten the critical look or a revisionist look later, right? I mean, we always debate our founding fathers and many issues about their personalities and beliefs and et cetera. But Lafayette seems to have escaped all that. And I was kind of wondering why you think that is. Why is he still just,
Well, I think part of it is just like being. I think if you look at sort of the American take on the American Revolution, we have this sort of like cohort of foreign officers who participated in the Continental Army, who we like. These are like von Steuben, like DeKalb, like Kosciuszko or Casimir Pulaski, and then Lafayette being sort of like the poster boy of this group of foreign officers who came across the Atlantic and helped us, do this thing, which is win independence for ourselves. So I don't really find us looking too critically at any of these people, right? They're just sort of there as characters in a story where the main protagonists and the main actors, or at least the people who had agency in this story, are the George Washingtons and Ben Franklins and Thomas Jeffersons. And these other guys are just here to, teach us how to do military engineering or run a cavalry, or in Lafayette's case, broker deals between the French and the Americans. So that's kind of where it stops with us. We just see him as a hero. But I do think that Lafayette does, because he had this very progressive outlook on the world, and because he wasn't a super genius, when he heard things like liberty, equality, he believed that meant people should be free, all people. When he heard equality, he thought, okay, everybody is created free and equal. They're equal. That means everybody. And to him, for example, that meant slaves. That meant slavery had to end. And if the American Revolution is going to mean anything, ultimately the slaves are going to have to be emancipated. And from a very early age, he's writing letters to Washington and Jefferson and Madison, all of whom are his personal friends. James Monroe, who's his personal friend, kind of harping on them. Like, you guys have set up this government that is like, and Lafayette really had admiration for what the United States was. He believed that it was this sort of beacon of progress on the world stage. And you guys need to fulfill what this beacon of progress actually represents: liberty and equality. You have to free your slaves. Please do it. And so I think that this, like, especially in our sort of current climate, has Lafayette coming off quite a bit better than many of our other founding fathers, because from a very young age, he's saying things that resonate with us today, in a way that many of the things that were said back then don't resonate with us anymore.
Yeah, I just, I'm curious too, because he, in a lot of ways, he's kind of more in the pain camp as far as radicalism goes. Mm-hmm. But that component of his personality doesn't really come through in a lot of the histories, right? Until your book, I was used to the standard, brave young man, lots of money, comes from France, fights and volunteers, but you don't really get this whole. No, he was kind of radical in some of his thoughts, and he was advocating, and equality meant equality, and freedom meant freedom. And
yep, he was a simple guy, he did believe these things and believed in them forcefully and quite courageously. Said a lot of things that were, he was so John Adams and Thomas Jefferson at different points in their lives both expressed sort of concern that Lafayette was just in it for the fame, right? That he was just going to run around chasing popularity, and that he would just say things that would make him popular, and he didn't actually have principles. And when you get him into the French Revolution, we just find that this was never true, and that those fears were completely unfounded. That he sort of did have this very core set of at least radical Republican beliefs, but also tempered by a real practicality, because he's obviously not so radical that he goes back to France and says, we need to tear down the monarchy. We need to abolish the Catholic Church. Like, he's never going to go that far. He always has a very sort of practical means through which he wants to achieve his quite radical ends, which is like a universal republic of equal people, regardless of race, regardless of class, regardless of wealth. And he does pursue this for his entire life. I mean, when he's 74 years old, he's still fighting for it just as much as he was when he was 19.
Yeah.
Lafayette gets to do something in his life that I just think is so awesome. 50 years after the Revolution, he gets to do a victory lap. He gets
Yeah.
to come back to the United States in 1824. He spends more than a year here, nearly 50 years after he arrives. So he's no longer the young boy. He's now the older, florid gentleman. And he gets to not only tour the scenes of his youthful triumphs, but he tours the whole country, and states that didn't exist when he was here 50 years before, to an outpouring of acclaim. And I am not even sure what question I would put on this, except is that why there are so many places named either after Lafayette or after, people may not even know that Lafayette's home in France was Lagrange. So every time you go to a town named Lagrange, that's also named after Lafayette.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
But that is an incredible, that victory lap. I mean, I would love to have a victory lap like that at some point, to be able to go venerated. Yeah, and it's not going to happen.
And I think we're all going to have to accomplish quite a bit more in our lives before we're offered a national...
speak for yourself. Speak for yourself.
But yeah, and there was actually a speech that was given on that tour by I think it was Henry Clay, who said, Lafayette, you are amidst posterity, right? Where he had sort of like, in a way, was living through like the future, because he was such a young guy when he joined the American Revolution. He was only 19. That he was in 1824 and 1825, when we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. He was the only surviving major general left from the Continental Army. Most of the people that he's talking to, even grown adults who have careers, wives and husbands and kids and mortgages that are all in their 30s and 40s, none of them were even born during the Revolution when it happened. They were all born after the Revolution. So he was this living link to what was in that moment in the 1820s already becoming sort of this like mythologized origin point that none of them had actually lived through. There were only very few of them left. Jefferson was left and John Adams was left, but they were going to die in a couple of years. So Lafayette was this sort of vibrant symbol of where the Americans had come from. And when he goes on this tour, he does visit all 24 states that existed. And this was a goal he set out to do. And he had to go on this like 3-day run through New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine in order to check off like the last 3 states. Like
he had to get the spoon. He had to get the spoon.
Yeah, man. It's like you go to the 4 corners, then you can get like 4 states.
Those are the checkoff states.
Yeah. So he's just. I did this when I was running through the South one time. I made it over to this part where I did like Arkansas, Mississippi, a couple others, like right one after the other. So he does this. But what I find really, really interesting about this, amidst all the other things that are interesting about it, is that Lafayette, as this Frenchman, is actually he's probably the most well-traveled in the United States of all the founding fathers. Most of them never left. They're all very parochial in terms of John Adams is from Boston. He's from Massachusetts. And Washington is from Virginia, and Jefferson is from Virginia. And yes, during his presidency, Washington kind of goes on some tours, and Washington also made it over into the Ohio country as a young man. But Lafayette's visiting all of those states, and he had run up and down the 13 colonies a couple times when he was a young man. He saw more of the United States than just about any of his contemporaries. He saw big cities, he saw tiny hamlets, he saw farms. He saw industrial centers. He sees the Erie Canal getting built. He's on the Mississippi out in the wilderness. Like he saw and met more of America than just about anybody else from his time period. And I think that too gives him this sort of unique role in American history, this unique place that he has. And the reason why everything is named after Lafayette is because he was a big deal. He was a very famous guy. And when you're running through St. Louis in 1824, which I don't know how many couple of thousand people lived in St. Louis in 1825, it was a big deal that he came to town. And so, of course, they're going to name a schoolhouse after him, a park after him, a county after him, a city after him. And so, yeah, there's literally thousands of things named after him. And most of it comes from that tour.
There's a great, Chris, if I may,
please.
There's a great story in, he comes to Lexington and Concord. And I lived in Lexington for many years. And he's sitting there at Concord, and one of the people welcoming Lafayette says, welcome to the spot of the first forcible resistance in the American Revolution. and this gets printed in the newspaper, and the people in Lexington are livid. They're livid because they say Concord was not where the revolution started. So they take a series of depositions from the old men who are left. These are the famous 1824 depositions where they all go, yeah, I fired, and I saw Joe fire, and, we fired muskets and stuff. And they take these depositions. Look, it started here. So then somebody in Concord says, and they do another set of depositions in Concord of the Concord militia people who say, well, I knew my friend Frank in Lexington for 50 years. He never said anything about firing a weapon at that time. And this battle starts between Lexington and Concord that honestly I would say still continues to this day.
No, there's a great, like, I think it's at Lexington. Yeah, I've been there a couple times, and like there's a museum that's just adjacent to the field, and there's like a whole hall that's about this battle between Lexington and Concord, trying to like a sort of meta commentary on these two towns. And of course, we know from that picture you took that it was actually a bunch of regulators down in North Carolina in 1771. So what are these guys even talking about?
And I wouldn't be my own vain self if I didn't say that what you're talking about, Mike, is an exhibit that I curated at the Lexington.
You curated that exhibit?
Yeah. I did.
That was really awesome. I remember that.
It's not still there.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
Fortunately.
There's another exhibit I curated. It's still there. But
I love that. That was my favorite part.
Well, it's just a story that was so easy to tell once you did the research, and so fascinating, and it's so human. Right?
I agree. I agree 100%. Yeah, we did some tours that were related to the podcast, and we ran them through there, and we had a great time looking at that and talking about it, just like these arguments. Because I mean, history and memory, these things merge, and then a lot of what we call history is ultimately sort of a creative conversation that every generation is having with itself about what our past actually is. So the process of all that is fantastic.
So Mike, you talk about in the book that Lafayette always viewed America through rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
Did the glasses ever come off, or did he ever struggle with that, or is that a belief that just kind of remained constant with him?
No, it did. I don't think he was naive about what the United States was, and he was absolutely not naive about what its problems were. He was constantly on them about the slavery issue and the racism issue, and he was constantly on them about basically fulfilling the promise of the American Revolution. But that said, he did think that the American Constitution and the American system of government and the United States of America as a political entity had inside of it the basically the capacity to reform itself and the capacity to overcome the obstacles between injustice and justice, right? He saw a lot of injustice in the United States. He talked a lot about this. He wrote about it. He spoke about it. But he didn't think that the United States was therefore irredeemable as a society. And in fact, quite the opposite. He believed that having set up this system of participatory government, with people being able to be elected and craft their own laws, and have all those laws apply equally to everybody in a strong Bill of Rights, that all the Americans really had to do was live up to the Bill of Rights and live up to the Declaration of Independence, both of which he thought were robust statements of principles that they ought to be living up to. And if they were falling short, that didn't mean it was impossible for them to get there. And so the rose-colored glasses are very real, in the sense that he's never going to not think that the Americans have it in them to basically listen to the better angels of their nature. He absolutely believes that, and will believe that to his dying day.
And after his dying day, John Adams pronounced him one of the first. John Adams actually said, and you have the quote in your book, "Pronounce him one of the first men of the age, and you have not done him justice. Where among the race of merely mortal men shall one be found as the benefactor of his kind, who shall claim precedence over Lafayette?" Yet in the next paragraph, you point out that a French figure during the Revolution, the Comte de Mirabeau, called him the man of indecision, an incapable and nefarious windbag.
Yeah,
doesn't sound
Mirabeau was spurned.
Obviously, he's got an axe to grind. But,
yeah, Mirabeau had an axe to grind.
I would sort of say, where do you come in on Lafayette, and did your opinion of him and how either him as a person or how important he was or why he was important change during the course of writing this book?
My attitude on him became obviously more sophisticated and sort of detailed. But I didn't find him. I found him more delightful as I came to know him more than I did. I wasn't often put off by things that he was saying. And what people have asked me as I was writing the book, like, are you writing a great man biography? Is this a great man biography? And I ultimately would say that no, I did not write a great man biography. First of all, he had his faults, he had his failures. If you're writing a great man story, usually what you need is your protagonist or your central character to be doing everything. History runs through his decision making. History runs through his office or through his tent. And then that's why things happen the way they did, because of this great man. And Lafayette was sometimes he was the master of his own destiny. Sometimes the things that he was saying and doing were impacting the course of history. Sometimes he was caught up in forces that were far beyond his control, and frankly, far beyond anybody's control. You take something like the French Revolution, he was being buffeted about just like everybody else was. And I think that there's something very relatable about this. Right, that he was not always in control of his circumstances, not always in control of the historical events that he was living with. But even more than that, when you think about the quote unquote great men of history, the Napoleons and the Alexander the Greats and the Julius Caesars, these guys sort of had a sociopathic indifference to human life. Their climb to the top of the historical mountain, it's a pile of corpses these guys are climbing up on top of. So Lafayette doesn't actually have that in him. He doesn't have that sort of incredibly ruthless drive to power. He never becomes president of France. He never overthrows a government so that he can become the sole leader. He's not Napoleon. He opposes Napoleon and everything Napoleon is trying to do. So it's not a great man biography, but I do think that Lafayette was a good man. I do think that fundamentally he wanted to make the world that he lived in a better place. When he saw suffering and injustice, he wanted to correct it. And he didn't just sort of complain about it or comment on it and say like, oh, isn't it so bad that this thing is happening? He spent his money on this. He spent his time on this. He risked his life on behalf of causes that he thought were worth laying his life down for. And so I think he was a good guy who mostly did good things and was pretty successful ultimately at accomplishing what he set out to accomplish. The France that he died into resembled a lot of what he was trying to achieve back in the 1770s and 1780s. And so I think I think Hero of Two Worlds is a good man biography, and that's where I'll leave it with Lafayette.
Well, Mike Duncan, Chris, do you have one more? Or
no, I was just going to say no. I was going to ask Mike if when he gets to the Russian Revolution, are you going to move to Russia? Because I think that you might have.
No, I'm in the middle of the Russian Revolution right now. The Bolsheviks literally just seized power last week.
All right,
Revolution podcast, and I am not moving.
The Chinese Revolution.
Yeah, Chinese
we'll look forward to having a very. I don't think we can go live from Beijing because of social media.
Well,
issues,
I'll go over there. I'll get hooked up with the regime. They'll feed me some documents, and I'll tell a very unbiased account of the.
Well, you can just start learning Chinese, and then we'll see how that goes.
Man.
Mike Duncan, this has been delightful. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
and we
Mike.
just want to remind everybody that Mike Duncan is the author of Hero of Two Worlds, the Marquis de Lafayette in the Age of Revolution. Enjoy the book, and we so appreciate your joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Good
you.
luck with everything.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you so much. And Chris, we have next week, Revolution November does continue. And
stand up when you make this announcement, please.
Who do we have next week? What possible subject of interest to you could we be talking about?
We have former History Happy Hour alumni Andrew Roberts talking about the last king of America, the goodly King George III and how he was done wrong. And he's
The
been
misunderstood
he's been maligned by history.
We have been. I want to say that Chris has been waiting for this book since
We
interviewed Andrew Roberts a year ago. And off air, he said, my next book is like George III, and we tried to book him like that day. It took another 6 months before he was willing to commit a day to it. But we are.
So we're
really
going to have a
delighted
special cocktail for the occasion next week.
Oh, that's a good idea. I think I'll have to try to come up with the same thing. But anyway, that's next week on History Happy Hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook. Do all those things so you can keep in the know on what's going on. And thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Be safe.
And, eventually I'll find the button to push.